Good morning or good afternoon to everybody, as the case may be. Welcome to this webinar. We're talking about the Safe Banking Act and a statistical analysis of a surge of robberies that occurred in Washington State a year ago, almost exactly, over a 4.5-month period. Port Angeles, Washington is a quiet town in Washington State, obviously, with a large retired population. It's located between Seattle and Olympic National Park. Only about 20,000 people live there. Tomorrow will be the 1-year anniversary of the day when 4 men, some armed, and all wearing masks, robbed a retail cannabis store in Port Angeles at around 11:30 p.m. at night. As you may know, robberies, as opposed to burglaries, entail either the threat of or the use of violence in furtherance of the crime. In this case, a manager and 2 other employees were on the premises and were preparing to close the store in 15 minutes. The men came in brandishing weapons, 1 or more weapons, and forced the employees to lay on the ground. They pistol whipped the manager. They demanded that the manager open one of the safes to get the cash, and hit the manager when the manager couldn't open one of the safes. They stole the cash that was accessible and some cannabis products, and then they fled. This particular armed robbery was one of almost 100 robberies that occurred in a 4.5-month period in Washington State last winter. At one point, we watched the robberies reach an average of more than 1 per day. Every day in our industry, we wondered who was going to be hit next and who or whether someone was going to die. As Dave said, my name is Mitzi Vaughn. I'm a board member of stopthedrugwar.org, also known as DRC Net Foundation. I'm a transactional attorney based here in Seattle, Washington. I'm a shareholder at Carr-Tuttle Campbell. I've been representing cannabis businesses for almost 10 years. And I have been representing industry groups, including the Cannabis Alliance, which is a national cannabis industry association, allied association based here in Seattle. Over the past years, I've watched my clients become victims of armed robberies, many repeatedly, and I actually have one client that has been hit 9 times in less than 2 years. While the surge of last winter was occurring, I was talking a lot with Dave Borden, who many of you know, who's the executive director of stopthedrugwar.org. He's located in DC, and as most of the country doesn't know a lot about what's going on in Washington, most of the country had no idea what we were experiencing. In the course of our conversations, Dave decided to do a statistical analysis of what we were experiencing here in Washington and try to show statistically that the level of violence increases because of the presence of cash. And of course, this is all in the context of the Safe Banking Act, which last year we worked particularly hard to try to get passed. And as some of you may know, it's in its last gasps. We still have hope, but it was stripped out of the National Defense Authorization Act last week by Mitch McConnell, and we'll talk a little bit about that more shortly. So stopthedrugwar.org, to introduce you to that, is primarily US based, but an organization that involves not only US federal and state policies, but foreign policies. We are part of the global community of reform-minded NGOs. We advocate in international venues, including having consultative status at the United Nations. And while our current emphasis are on, for example, the Philippines and the brutal drug war killings there, the level of violence that occurred in Washington and, the personal connections here warranted a discussion about the relationship between cash and what was occurring. So to introduce you to Dave, Dave, as I said, is the executive director of stopthedrugwar.org. He oversaw the organization's work earlier on with the Higher Education Act reform campaign in an effort to repeal a federal law that denied students financial aid because of drug convictions. And it was finally repealed in December 2020. And so that was quite a coup for Dave. He served as the executive editor of the Drug War Chronicle newsletter since its founding in 1997. And he is the author of the Dangerous Delays report that we are here to discuss today. So I'd like to throw it over to Dave to discuss not only his findings, but the genesis of the report.
Thanks, Mitzi. And I am just, it always takes me a moment to set up my screen share. Are people seeing a PDF file with some charts in it?
Yes.
Good. Thanks for joining us today. And we convene as the SAFE, as Mitzi referred to, the SAFE Act once again this year gets taken up, having passed the House of Representatives, but at risk of being stalled in the Senate. There was an encouraging article this morning that Senator Schumer and other Democratic and Republican senators are trying again to push this through. So we will see what happens. SAFE, as per the name, was written to address this safety issue that Mitzi described, and as Mitzi has described, affects people's lives. Since it first came up in Congress, and since the first hearings, which I think Neill will talk about because he was part of them, a lot of the focus in the discussion has shifted to other issues that marijuana policy pertains to. Very important issues: equity and inclusion in the industry, criminal justice reform efforts like expungement of marijuana or their drug offenses, social justice issues. And while that discussion is good, it has in some ways come at the expense of the safety issue, and at the risk of reigniting contention that our movement has suffered from. I will observe that at times the safety issue has gotten ignored in some of the rhetoric. And we have seen arguments made during the past year that have attempted to cast doubt on the role of cash in fueling robberies, or the total importance of robberies in the cannabis store robberies in the grand scheme of things, as part of casting the safety issue as an industry talking point. Our analysis confirms that cash dominates as the target for armed robberies. And we did find, as I tested statistically, elevated aggression levels and a larger number of different aggression types on average per incident for a type of robbery that takes place, namely robberies targeting the back of the store, which in the great majority of cases are people are trying to get cash from the safe, and they usually need an employee to do so. I will add that there are limitations to what we can do with this amount of data, and so what we could make statistically significant findings on was a little limited. And let me just pause for a second to make sure no one is in the trying to get in on the waiting room. I will momentarily stop the screen share. Okay, no, we are good. Sorry about that. So, you know, as Mitzi noted, Washington suffered a really bad event. It started in November 2021, lasted 4.5 months, documented, saw nearly 100 armed robberies of cannabis stores in Washington state. Those affected roughly 80 stores, meaning some stores were hit more than once. and 3 people were killed. One of them, many of you doubtless know the name, Jordan Brown, an employee. There were also the suspects in 2 robberies, one of whom was killed by a police officer in a shootout, and the other was shot by a guard at the store. And though most of the focus of our sympathy is first with the murdered employee, but we're not happy about any of those events. So thanks to the Washington cannabis community and organized by the Uncle Ike's pot shop, and we have Uncle Ike himself here, will be presenting soon. There is data to work with. The Uncle Ike's tracker, well, you'll hear more about it, but we were able to use that to construct a data set to do some analysis. We classified incidents where information was available in a few different ways. Property stolen, which meant cash, product, or both. Did the robbery target the back store versus remaining only at the front of the store? Again, back of the store in the great majority of cases means the safe and cash. And we defined 4 aggression categories based on what we saw in the news articles. One of them was brandishing weapons or holding people at gunpoint. We combined those because they serve the same function. One of them is assaulting workers. One of them is firing a weapon, which actually happens for a bunch of different reasons. Most of the time, it's not trying to shoot a person, though some people were shot and 1 killed by robbers. And the other is deliberately pointing at a weapon at a person, meaning like right at the face or back. All of these categories are meant to represent aggression levels that are more than what's already inherent in any armed robbery. Our report, first, it looks at the scale of the crisis. And what we're looking here at the screen, the chart on top is from 2017 to through around August 2022. All the robberies tracked on Uncle Ike's. There are also some burglaries we removed and a handful of unconfirmed reports that we didn't include in the statistics. And the second chart is for the surge, defined for us as most of November through April, the November last year through this past April, and so it has this classic shape to it where it grows and peaks and drops. We looked at the property, type of property stolen. This is for 2017 to 2022. And these are not all the robberies that took place. These are the ones that got tracked. The ICE tracker doesn't have everything. Police data, which there's a process you can use to try to identify them, which would take, I'd say, resources. They don't have everything either. So as we see, it's about 40% of the robberies were solely cash. About, I forget the exact number, over 50 were, about 60% were both cash and product were taken. Cash was a little under 50 and product was about 10%. During the surge, the same pattern, but there was just one product only theft, and cash only went up to 45%. Now, I presented this both cash or product. Another way to think about it is that all of the robberies but one that we know anything about involved cash, and there was just one product only robbery. And then a bit over half involved both cash and product. But so you have cash almost all the time, product a good amount of the time, but a lot of cash-only robberies, just one during the surge, product only. Now, it's worth also looking at burglaries. There are only a limited number. The Ike tracker is not primarily robberies, and they probably get reported less often. The great majority of them are only products, so it's the opposite and even more. So what it looks like, it's hard to prove things, but what it looks like is when robbers, people who steal for a living, whose main interest is the product, they have an option of doing a burglary, which involves less risk to them, less risk of encountering people, likelihood of a shorter prison term, if any, if they're caught, than because you don't have to carry a weapon when you're doing a burglary. And if you're carrying a weapon, which you do generally in a robbery, you're likely to get a tougher sentence. So those are what the property numbers look like. Aggression is the third axis. So these charts for the full time period and then for the surge just simply counts. And the fourth one, there's elevated aggression. It's alphabetically ordered. Ideally, we would have that one last or first or separated. The numbers are smaller than what we get for property, and they don't perfectly intersect with the incidents for which we know the property categories. And so that limits what we can compute with statistical significance. Another limitation is that we have to go based on what the reporting puts down. In most cases, news articles. In news writing, you don't generally write down every detail. It's a different type of writing. It serves a different purpose. So some of these may be undercounted. I believe that the brandishing weapon category is undercounted, and that all or nearly all of the robberies targeting the back of the store would involve that. That's just a guess. If so, that would increase the strength of some of our findings. I think it's possible that front store robberies, there are more cash-only robberies. Only saw one example, one case in which a robber simply went up to the register and told the employee there, I have a gun, give me the cash and I'll leave. And that happens. That seems like it would happen more and would have a good chance of not getting reported because it's the least dramatic. That's only a guess. If it does, then cash would make up a larger proportion. Although for the front of the store would have a smaller, lesser tie to aggression. If that's all the robber did, there would be zero elevated aggression categories in that case. So I hypothesized for this test that back of the store robberies would have more aggression. We've heard as from Port Angeles. There's a pattern. It's recurred through the years when robbers want the cash from the safe. Safe cracking used to be a common skill. People who went into property crime trained in it. Crime has a lot of similarities to a legal business. There is much less cash around in society now, so there's less use for it. Saw one safe cracking case among the burglaries. So you need an employee, and if they don't have the combination to the safe, the robbers might not believe them. Can be a trigger for assault. So, and you have to control an employee to bring them to the back of the store. So does the back of the store, which mostly is about cash, involve higher aggression levels? And we can see from some numbers here, this is for the surge time period, that nearly 3 times the rate documented with any kind of aggression level, any kind of elevated aggression for backstore robberies. The aggression levels, which is a count of the number of aggression types, I defined 4 of them. So that's going to be an integer between 0 and 4. For the surge, this title should be over here in the first column. There is nearly twice the average for backstore robberies as for front store robberies. For the entire time period, it's a lot closer. And in fact, we don't have statistically significant findings for the full time period, at least not yet. That doesn't mean they aren't there to be found. But without the statistical significance, there could be something different. And we have to be upfront about that. So there was just more aggression, at least documented, possibly for real, in front store robberies over the full several years as for the time period of the surge. And that's the reason why we don't get the statistical significance. As you can see from the product theft levels with aggression, which we also tested, those are quite close for both time periods, other than the product. And so for cash versus cash plus product, we don't have statistical significance because it's just too close for the amount of data that there is. For product only, we don't have the statistical significance because product only robberies just don't happen very often. And that latter point is its own finding, but it's not a tie to aggression. But analytically, we did not start with a model that specifically said cash or product or both should have different aggression levels inherently. There will be, okay. The statistical correlation finding we made is in this small table. This is for the time period of the surge. And we found this for in front store, back store again, when we looked at this, but I'll explain the numbers. Let's at the left, any aggression, that means any of the 4 categories that you see in the middle columns, was there 1 or more? And the number, that's called a p-value, 0.033. That is the probability that the findings we got, the correlation that was seen could have occurred just by chance, and these are really equal, but there's statistical fluctuation. And so that's less than 5%. And so that's considered in sociology, not in clinical medicine. That's very important, but in sociology, criminology, that's considered statistically significant. Another way of putting it is 95% confidence level. If you look at the right, aggression level, again, that's the number of different types, 0 to 4, p-value is 0.015. So even stronger, and within the 5%, less than 5% probability that could be by chance. Then we look in the middle. The only one that comes out close is for brandishing or holding people at gunpoint, 0.078. That's less than 10% or more than 90% confidence. That's called marginal statistical significance. If my guess is right, that all or nearly all of the back of the store robberies should have included this. I only included it when the article or the police report said so. That would increase the significance level, and I'm pretty certain it would. The p-value would go below 0.05. Right now, that's just an educated guess. And the others, they're more than 0.05. We don't have statistical significance. Doesn't mean there's isn't something there to be found, but I'll talk about specifically the case of weapons fire. Happens for a lot of different reasons. The inexperience, like professionalism, as Mitzi referred to. People can be trying to blow open a door or a cash register, or maybe the safe, though I don't recall seeing that. could be firing to intimidate at the ceiling or wall or floor, or they can be firing at a person. And so a different analysis, maybe the next one would break those out. But I don't think we have enough data just from here to get statistical significance from that. We could look at all those incidents individually, and I did read through them. If you go to the Uncle Ike's tracker, after I'm done, I'll put the link in for there. You can find links to articles. And at the end, in the appendix, the second to last section of our report before the end notes, I list for each of the incidents what categories I tagged. So I think that's everything I wanted to talk about statistically. I'll just briefly say, because I'm sure I'm over time, and Mitzi, you said you were going to be strict about time. I hope you're more strict with my fellow speakers who are all more important than me. There's discussion in the paper too, and there were some questions that came up in looking at this issue. One is, you don't see so many robberies in legalization or medical states on the East Coast. You see them really in the West. And it looks to me like what maybe the reason is that more of the stores out West are depleted financially. The profit margins have dropped in a way that largely hasn't happened out East, although articles are hitting this week, prices plummeting in Massachusetts. That's a change people should be looking at. There are many more stores, more competition amongst each other, and it's gone on for longer because they legalized first. So they have less cash because there are more of them, because the prices have dropped, and more of them, a much larger percentage, are independent, truly small businesses who don't have the deep pockets of the multi-state operators. On the East, much higher percentage of multi-state operators. They have an investment capital. There are fewer stores, more of a cash concentration per store. And other than what we seem to have heard, we are seeing in Massachusetts right now, profit margins are still high. So maybe they're better able to afford consistent spending on security. And so for those of us who care about, would like to see small businesses be able to succeed, and more of them, the equity businesses, we need to be thinking about how can costs be brought down for the businesses in responsible ways. Normalizing banking is a significant one. There are bigger ones, but it's one of the larger ones that in the short term conceivably could be brought down. Another question is, why did this happen in Washington when it did? And could it happen again? In criminological research, and this makes sense intuitively, it's noted that cash usage in society has really decreased in recent decades. And that, of course, accelerated during the pandemic. So with less cash around, robbers are more desperate and they have fewer targets. And so establishments that have street robbery, muggings aren't very profitable because people aren't carrying the cash anymore, and the credit card will get turned off quickly, maybe automatically. So they are more focused on the remaining sources of cash and of valuable merchandise.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about that now. Let's talk about let's hear from the people who were on the ground during this.
Let me just make one final note on that, which is that's not expected to reverse. And so what happened in Washington may be a sign of the times in that respect. And we should worry that it could happen again as part of these times in the absence of changes. So thanks.
Okay, so really quickly, I'm going to show you I can't show you, they disconnected it. Okay, well, Dave's going to throw the link up to the Ike's tracker, and basically it's just a big spreadsheet, and it's got the name of the store, the address, the city, whether or not it was armed robbery, how many people. These, now we start getting into what we knew and what we didn't know, right, in reporting this. Who the people were, whether or not they used weapons, what the police report numbers were, and what links where possible to media. And all of this was put together by Uncle Ike's Pot Shop. So I want to introduce you to Ian Eisenberg. Ian is the owner and operator of Uncle Ike's. Uncle Ike's consists of 5 cannabis stores, a car wash, and a liquor store. His past ventures have included US Network, a leading provider of IVR-based telephone solutions. Blue Frog Mobile was a venture-backed wireless and television entertainment firm. He also is a founder of Zevia LLC, a maker of the first all-natural zero-calorie soda. He also has an interest in real estate. He's a Renaissance man. He attended Seattle Prep High School, graduated from Seattle U with a BS degree in business management and humanities. His family has been in Seattle in the Central District since the early 1900s. Ian, thank you so much, first of all, for joining us. And, you know, in doing this work, Dave and I kind of really were able to understand the magnitude of what the tracker became. And so I was hoping that you could talk to us about why it started, because the first entry is in, February 2017. And so I don't know when the actual tracker was started and why. So I was hoping you could talk to us about that.
Yeah, we really started it during the protest era after the Floyd incident. And everybody, everybody in the industry knew that crime was skyrocketing, and everybody thought somebody else was tracking it. People would say they are tracking it, they being the LCB, the Liquor and Cannabis Board, they being the police, they being the State Patrol, but nobody was tracking it. So we just decided to try to put together a spreadsheet and do a little verification, because there's so many rumors about robberies. So we try to confirm it with the store owner, employees, or media, or police, to get something in paper. And once we started getting on paper, it was like an everyday occurrence.
And so on a personal level, how many times have your stores been robbed?
We've been pretty lucky. We were robbed once we've been open for about 9 years. We were robbed once in the early days and once in the kind of the beginning of this new trend. But we haven't gotten robbed more because we've invested a lot of money in security. And
Okay.
That's probably something you should mention. 280E is what's really preventing stores from having rational security measures. But I don't know if it's the right time, but one thing that has to be talked about in this discussion is what's specific to Washington State and what's specific to Seattle. We've been a cash business for 9 years, and the robberies haven't been an issue, really. It's been pretty safe. And in Washington, we've had banking since day one. We have credit unions, we have armored car pickups. We have things that maybe other states don't have. But what's changed here is basically depolicing in Seattle and Washington State. We were kind of our police in Seattle were dangerously understaffed going into the Floyd issue. And then after now we're running about 800 to 900 police in Seattle, where we should have 2,000. So there is no risk of getting arrested. It's not just pot shops. Crime has gone up. Crime's gone up, skyrocketed across the board. And even if you do get caught, you're probably not going to get prosecuted. We have a lot of activist prosecutors. And if you do get prosecuted, you're going to get out on no cash bail. So most of these robbers that have been arrested should be in jail. And 5 years ago, they would have been. So like the street perception of crime it's kind of a free-for-all. And the police have told us we're on our own. If it's not a priority 1 call, if it's 2 or 3, police probably aren't going to show up. It's just a kind of, and one other thing, there was a decision in Washington State called the Blake decision, which basically decriminalized minor possession of hard drugs. So you can have 3 grams of fentanyl and meth, and it's created sort of a worst case scenario in Seattle. So whatever police we have left are dealing with hard drug related street crime, shoplifting, muggings, things like that. So
Well,
it's-
and I would point out that that while that is true on the ground, the nature of the businesses being robbed are artificially restricted to cash rich businesses. And there are some that are cash rich because it's the nature of the business, like pawn shops or paycheck cashing places. And there are some that are being restricted because of lack of banking. Now, even though we have had banking, it's expensive, right? And one of the things that we also found is, you know, you are traveling to the banks that we can access, which by the way are credit unions primarily, don't necessarily have a drop right next door. It's not like a Wells Fargo where they're just everywhere. And so people don't go there every time.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important, while Ian's points are correct, and the observations, I mean, living here, you can't ignore that. But also part of what we're talking about is what you brought up about 280E also applies to the expenses that are incurred by businesses with banking, right? The expense that cannabis businesses incur to have a bank account is far higher than what a non-cannabis business would have, for the most part. So, you know, this has never been a simple issue, and I think anybody involved in it knows that. Another thing that we're going to talk about a little bit later is the fact that the Safe Banking Act doesn't provide for electronic payments, right? And so we're still talking about having cash, but perhaps we're talking about having banking geographically closer, logistically closer, so that you're not keeping bags of money in the back until you have the time to go to the bank or whatever the specific circumstances are.
Yeah,
So,
and it hasn't helped that, you know, prior to the past 2 years, the LC, our Liquor and Cannabis Board, had a no gun policy in the stores. And it was a little bit ambiguous what it meant, but we have big signs on the front of the stores, like this is a no gun zone.
Right.
So bad guys know it's a no gun zone. Since then, the Liquor and Cannabis Board has relaxed those or reinterpreted those restrictions, but it wasn't widely known if you were allowed to have armed security or not. We chose to, a lot of stores chose to, but the armed security was put us in the black every month. That was the profit margin and then some.
Yeah, so, and yeah, there's obviously economic losses associated with this as well, right? So it's a little bit of a tangled situation, but another thing to point out, and if I could throw the tracker on the screen, you could see, you know, these aren't all in Seattle. You know, that one that we started discussing was in Port Angeles, which is just you know, it's a pretty small town. So, you know, Seattle's policing issues contributed, but we also have things that we've talked about in the community, like the more press, the more violence, right? So the more press that these stores are perhaps vulnerable, the more violence there is. And so that can also snowball. Can
I add one thing too about the tracker?
Of course.
We think the tracker is pretty underrepresented of the crime, because a lot of cannabis stores that we talk to don't want to report robberies for a couple of reasons. One, it hurts business. You know, customers don't want to go to a store that was robbed. And also the people in every community that has a pot store has activists that are anti-pot stores in the community. And they use that as a tool that, look, it's getting robbed, it's putting our community at risk. We should have bans and moratoriums. And you mentioned Seattle and Port Angeles, but the no pursuit rules are statewide.
Right, no, that's true. Okay, so speaking of, I think it's good because what you've talked about actually leads into the next person's perspective about the security and the policing issue and all of kind of what is associated with running a cannabis store in Seattle. And so I'd like to introduce John Branch. He's an electrical engineer, a registered patent attorney, and managing partner of Branch Partners PLLC, which specializes in providing intellectual property legal services for software clients. He when he owned a cannabis retail store. During that time period, he also served on the board of the Washington Cannabis Association for 5 years, participated in lobbying for cannabis-friendly legislation at both state and federal levels. He founded his store Ponder in August of 2015 and sold it this past June. And it, like one of Ian's stores, was located in the Central District of Seattle. So John, thanks for coming and talking to us. So security guards, in particular, what Ian said about security guards, you have a little bit of a different take on the security guard issue. And I was hoping that you could talk to us a bit about your thoughts when it came to hiring an armed security guard.
Sure. I had an extremely brutal robbery and with some very amateurish folks that wearing Crocs and tennis shoes that weren't tied and had the fingers on the trigger and pistol whipping people and basically terrorized my staff, made people crawl on the ground and say they're going to kill them before they leave. Just unbelievable, crazy stuff. So to show that I was going to try and help, I decided, well, I'll hire a security guard that had a gun. And not going to name the company, but I met the people and they said, I want you to talk to the guy who's going to carry the gun. And he says, okay, yeah, I have a wife and kids. Just want you to know that if someone pulls out a gun, I'm going to shoot him dead. I'm not going to shoot a warning shot, not going to negotiate, not going to spray him with pepper spray first. I just have a family and I'm not the popo. And, I had a staff that didn't want to come back. So I put the security guard out there for about 2 weeks. And I was reflecting on that I'm going to have to kill people to make money selling marijuana. That's just going to be part of the business now, have someone in that position to do that. And because of the kind of violence we were seeing, the likelihood of that happening seemed like it was increasing. And I made that decision. At that point, I was like, I already was, for a variety of other reasons, thinking about selling. And that was just the tipper. I was just like, there are easier ways to make money. I got in this to try and make a difference in a new industry, and it's had its arc. And it's time to move on to someone else who feels more comfortable in that role. But I'm not going to pay someone to sit there and shoot someone over, marijuana. That was it.
So in addition to that, how many times was your store robbed?
Well, at the beginning, Ian mentioned, it's kind of a, semi-regular thing, but not that bad. It was more professional type, I hate to say it, but they'd come in, like I remember one group, I first opened the first year and I was getting it like every 6 to 9 months of robbery. And they would show up and they had a guy at the door counting the minutes, like 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute. And when we got to 4 minute, they all ran out and jumped in a car and took off. And everybody was like, had gear on and they were masked up and gloves and their fingers weren't on the trigger. And then the last couple of years, it increased, and it was people that looked a lot. One robber got arrested because the police did come by during the robbery and they got the car. And one guy wasn't as fast a runner as all the rest, and it was a high school kid. But I was like, one of the things I was told to do was focus on the footwear, because often the robbers will just come back the next day, and not have a different jacket. You might be able to recognize them that way, So anyway, so I was noticing that they were wearing Crocs and untied tennis shoes, and again, the fingers on the trigger, and just a younger, more reckless group of robbers. People more likely, and then more violent too. They seem to want to prove something, and so and they spent longer time in the store. Like the last robbery, they were in the store almost 12 minutes and police showed up 15, 16 minutes later, even though we had a, rob an alarm and stuff. There was a lot more time now in Seattle to rob. You don't have the 4 or 5 minute response anymore, as Ian mentioned. It's really hard to, you're kind of on your own.
And can you Can you talk about the underreporting issue too? Because I know some of your robberies are not on that tracker. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, I don't even bother with the burglars. You know, breaking in when someone's not there at this point, because I there's someone across the street from my building that comes over and I think they just get drunk and they decide to try and break in. I've had them on video a couple times and the police don't do anything. And you know, as long as it was basically kind of put to me, unless someone's shot or killed, they're kind of busy. And this one robbery I mentioned where this the last real brutal one we had, because actually I never got to meet with a detective. He was too busy. And I just submitted a video and hoped that maybe it wouldn't happen to someone else. So
Can you just tell us that particular incident in detail to kind of wrap this up? Because I really think it's important that people understand the level of violence that we were seeing and are seeing.
sure. So, you know, going with like a big guy out front, he's about 300 pounds, big dude, used to play football. They just were walking down the street. He said hello to them. They turned around, pulled out guns, young guys, and hit him in the face with a pistol, knocked him to the ground, and opened the door and said, crawl. And he crawled into the store, and you know, you can imagine how the staff were, they're the bud tenders. And they announced that they were going to kill him before they left, but he'd be alive as long as everybody cooperated. And they made him crawl on his hands and knees to the back of the store. My manager was there. We have a drop safe that's electronic and you can't open it. And they stuck a gun in his ear and said, well, we're going to kill you if we don't get any money. So you decide what you're going to do here, because I'm going to shoot you both dead. And we had another kind of, not the electronic safe, a little petty cash safe. And so other guys were out front grabbing and knocking people over, pulling cash out of the tills. And we had a petty cash safe and got that out and change, and they grabbed all that. You know, kept on slapping people with the guns, poking people with the guns, and they had their fingers on the trigger the whole time, which is just like, you know, I don't know, maybe, you know, it was really scary for everyone. There was a woman there. They pulled on her. She started crying and crying, you know. That's happened before. They'll try and grab one of the women and take them with them. I don't know if that's just to terrorize, but they've never actually got someone out the door. The women usually start crying and fall to the floor. And that similarly happened. And this was an incident that didn't rise to the level of having a cop even, you know, investigate the issue. They came by, and then actually in the middle of taking our statements and stuff, another pot store was being robbed, and apparently nearby, and they just took off.
So thanks for sharing that, John. Part of the discussions that Dave and I had are about our desire to help people understand that even though SAFE isn't going to provide electronic payments, SAFE is one step in the right direction. And the least we can do for our industry and our employees is to start down that path. So that, you know, for those of you who aren't intimately familiar, the Safe Banking Act, it would, it's passed, first of all, it's passed the House of Representatives 7 times. It was trying to get through the Senate up until last week through the National Defense Authorization Act. But Mitch McConnell took the Senate floor last Wednesday and he gloated about getting it out. And he called, let's see here, the Democrats were trying to get, by the way, this is bipartisan, but they were trying to get a grab bag of miscellaneous pet priorities, like making our financial system more sympathetic to illegal drugs. So that was his statement on the issue. It's being perceived also as kind of splitting the Republican Party. But as we see more states legalize, at this point, we should have critical mass behind this, but it's become somewhat of a political football in various areas. We're very fortunate to have somebody joining us, Neill Franklin, who was very early on part of advocating for the Safe Banking Act. Major Neill Franklin is a retired major from the Maryland State Police. He's a 34-year law enforcement veteran and former executive director of Law Enforcement Action Partnership. He retired from the Maryland State Police, where he commanded the Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement. And after his state police tenure, he was recruited by the Baltimore City Police Department to reconstruct and command the education and training section. Neill is a regular law enforcement contributor on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, and his writings have been published in the LA Times, Washington Post, New York Times, and more. Neill, thank you so much for coming. We're really pleased to see you. And, we were just hoping that you could talk about your involvement in SAFE in the early days and kind of where you see us now.
Yeah, so, well, this February, it'll be 4 years since I first testified in Congress regarding SAFE. And I mean, back then it got a lot of attention, but this report we did not have. We didn't have this type of data. And I'll talk a little bit about what was in some of my testimony relevant to this conversation we're having today about these robberies. It's a very, very serious matter, but I wish we had this data. I wish we had this Uncle Ike's tracking system back then. In my career, most of my career was in criminal investigation and investigating, robberies similar to this, but not involving dispensaries, just the typical robberies that we have in communities all across the country. And of course, I started this drug policy work back around 2008. And again, from a law enforcement perspective, it was the violence surrounding the illicit trade that piqued my interest. And that's a whole nother story, but that's what moved me into this space of arguing, having these conversations about moving things such as cannabis into a legal market. And now that we're here in many states across the country, how do we make it safe? How do we solve this issue of what is primarily a cash only business? So let me just talk quickly about some of my testimony and some of the things that were discussed back in 2019. Some of the things that we could talk about were cases that we knew of. So in 2012, for instance, Melinda Haig, I think she was the U.S. Attorney for Northern California. She said this, quote this, "Marijuana dispensaries are full of cash. They are at risk of being robbed, and many of them are." So now this is 2012, that's 10 years ago. And here we are still fighting this battle. And it was also said that one example of what can happen, in 2012, 3 people were kidnapped. The owner of a lucrative dispensary in Orange County, some of you may remember this case, by the way, be familiar with it. According to court documents, the assailants zip-tied the victim, tortured them, and drove him to a patch of desert where they believe he had buried large sums of money. Again, why would someone be burying money? Because they can't put it into a bank. And remember, we're going back some years. They tortured this guy out in the desert, and I won't mention some of the graphic things that they did to this individual, but it was quite horrific. And that was one of the examples we talked about during this hearing in 2019. And one other thing that I quoted during this hearing was, although extremely important for business owners and the people they employ, and I was talking about the loss of property and cash, my greatest fear is not the loss of profits due to theft. It is the potential for serious assaults and death to people attempting to protect that cash or who are merely just responsible for it. And I fear that dispensary employees are at the greatest risk. So that's what we're hearing today. That's what we're hearing from John, as he just talked about, and he just described, this one particular robbery where he was talking about the security guard. And, David earlier talked about when he was going through the data, which again was just so important. And when I read that report, I was like, oh my God, it's about time that we've started a system of collecting this data and looking at it from so many different directions. But he mentioned 4 areas of aggression regarding this data, and that's brandishing a weapon, assaulting workers, firing a weapon, pointing a weapon. And, collecting that type of data is extremely important. But as I wrap up here, and I'm not gonna be long, I just wanna talk a little bit about the robberies, the cash versus product. Let me just say these robberies are about cash. The stealing of a product, that's an added bonus for these folks who are committing the robberies. Now, burglaries are a different story. If they happen to come across money, that's fine. But when you commit a robbery, it's about cash because you need the people to access the safe. When you commit a burglary, it's a very good chance you're not going to get into the safe if there's any money on site. It would be stored in a safe. So I wanted to point that out. And David mentioned some of the differences between West Coast and East Coast numbers, and what may be causing such disparities. He was talking a little bit about what we refer to as target hardening. So if you had the money to design a facility to make it very difficult for people to commit robberies, it's not cheap. It's very expensive to hire the people, security guards and so on. But let me talk a little bit about security guards and what John was kind of like, well, you'll see what I'm talking about regarding his story. Hiring a security guard is not your only expense. Hiring that armed person is not your only expense. You have to create and design a facility that also protects that security guard from being exposed to what John just depicted in this story. Because when those who want to commit the robberies are planning it, knowing that there's an armed security guard on the premises, that is their first target. He or she is the first target, as we've just heard about. So you have to design your facility to also protect the security guard so that they can't be surprised, like in John's depiction. Here's an analogy also regarding target hardening that you can relate to. So what do we do, right? And this is what this conversation is about. This is the holiday season. And one of the things we, the police, always tell shoppers to do when they're out at these malls and shopping and putting things in their car, we tell you, do not put packages in your car. Do not leave anything in your car. The reason we tell you that is because, as you know, if someone who wants to steal sees the packages in the car, they're going to break into the car. Versus, buying or constructing a car that you can't break into with shockproof windows, or basically an armored car. That's very expensive. So don't do that. Just don't leave items in your car. This is the same thing. This is what SAFE is about. How do we create an environment so there's no cash or very, very little cash in our dispensaries? That will protect all dispensaries, not just the ones that can afford to target harden themselves. Cash is king when it comes to criminals. That's always been the word. Cash is worth its stated value. It says $10 on the bill, it's worth $10. If it says 100, it's worth 100. But stolen goods are not. Even when it comes to cannabis, even when it comes to marijuana. If it's stolen, they're going to try to get rid of it as quickly as possible. Stolen goods are usually sold at a discounted price, especially as we move more and more into a regulated market across the country. So, and I'll end with this, as John spoke a little bit about, giving you that depiction of what occurred and how these people were dressed, wearing their footwear and, basically pros versus opportunists. Opportunists are the most dangerous. These are the folks who get together and say, hey, we know there's cash in that dispensary. Let's go get some of it. You know, I got a couple guns, blah, blah, blah. We'll pick a day. We just go do it. The pros, this is what they do. You know, they'll do their recon. They'll see who's on the premises, what time, what day, what time of the day, you know, how many armed security people, if any. They'll even do things maybe to test the response of the police and the time. They're going to time themselves getting in, getting out. Everybody's going to have an assignment. You know, they're usually going to be in groups of probably 3 or more. And you can tell the difference. The opportunists, they're nervous. They're not prepared generally. They just want to go in and try to get some money. That's when accidents happen. As John said, fingers on the trigger, extremely dangerous. But at the end of the day, it's about removing the cash from the dispensaries, going to electronic services, you know, dispensary owners being able to use banking facilities to place their cash and their money, and to do that as quickly as possible. It's been 4 years since that hearing I was involved in. And again, I really don't understand why it's taking so long, but we all know it's politics. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Neill. About your hardening the target, that's a great kind of wrap, I think, for us, because I will say that once the Liquor and Cannabis Board here in Washington decided to officially respond to what was happening, now, granted, they can't offer banking services, right? So they're kind of limited. However, they sent an email out that's basically suggested that people just don't know that they should harden their target. And kind of the perception was completely ignoring that, boy, if I could afford it, I would, you know, I'd love to harden my target. And so that was, that's the kind of response that they could offer at the time. But it also showed, unfortunately, a little bit of a deaf ear to the financial realities of that in our industry, because we are so heavily regulated and limited. Our population is small. Our already limited markets are further, the profits are further damaged by 280E and all the, you know, things we've been talking about. So this is a really critical issue to the Washington community. It's a critical issue to the country, as we know. And we really were hoping that with Dave's statistical analysis, which we didn't know how that was going to turn out, by the way, you know, we didn't know when he started all that hard work, what we were going to find, what Dave was going to find. I'd love to say that I had anything to do with all of that work, but I really didn't. And that's what we found. And so, you know, putting aside policing, putting aside, you know, what's happening with kind of decriminalization of possession, all that means is that there's more people doing it, but that doesn't have anything to do with the amount of violence that we're seeing, right? And the correlation to the cash as opposed to the product. It just means that we sadly have a larger statistical pool to examine under these circumstances. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I know we ran a little bit late, but please do read the report. You can access it on stopthedrugwar.org. It's at the top of the chat. You can also, I think the link to the Uncle Ike's tracker is there if you want to take a look at it. Just make sure you scroll all the way to the right so you can see the links to the police reports and more information that they have worked so hard to collect. And so we also very much are in debt to Ian and to Uncle Ike's pot shop, to the employees there for doing all that work on behalf of the community. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a great day. Great Friday.
Yes, thank you from me as well, and appreciate your taking the time, as well as seeing some old friends here. So take care, and we wish the very best of luck to Senator Schumer and others who have indicated right now they are trying again to get safe through this year. Really hope they succeed, but there's going to be more work to get done on this, even if they do. Doug asked in the chat if we were taking questions. I think unofficially, I'm willing to keep things open. I'm not going anywhere. Some of our speakers have left. Anyone who wants to stay, talk some more, I'll be glad to. I know some of our speakers were on schedules.
Well, I just have a couple.
Sure, let's hear them.
Sure. I mean, the SAFE Act would make it legal for banks to do business with shops, but what evidence do you have that banks would actually choose to offer services to the population of businesses that are experiencing these robberies should SAFE pass?
Well, I would say, well, first, the SAFE Act explicitly protects depository relationships. We don't know what, if anything, it will do for credit cards. And if the major credit card networks don't come on board, then that will leave things would continue to be in a difficult place with debit cards. There was news just last week or this week that a lot of the cashless ATMs are just being shut down. So we don't know exactly what will happen, but we have seen that steps that have been taken from the federal government, from states, and with seeing implementation over time is that bank account access for businesses has become more available. It's really hard to see a federal law being passed that explicitly says this is okay, and then banks not providing the services. You don't need every bank to do it. You need some, and the more you have, the more likely the bank is to be physically close to where you are, which decreases the risks of taking multiple trips to it with cash, increases the incentive to get your cash out of it to your bank if you don't have as far to go. I wondered if something related. A dispensary operator who I won't say who, but we both know. Was one of a number of people I spoke with, just trying to get an understanding of this. He described the financial services side as an onion, and so this person's business has been able to keep the same bank account for quite a few years now. For many years, that was not the case. He's been able to do it, he told me, by doing a few things. He doesn't put more than $100,000 into the bank account at any given time. And he doesn't do transfers that individually or collectively would get above that range. As a result, he personally, on a regular basis, carries, they can't get armored transport. He personally carries upwards of $250,000 of cash to cover their taxes. The reason he works within those constraints is because if he goes beyond them, then the banks, according to federal rules and perhaps their own rules set by their risk departments, will flag the accounts and they'll do an audit, and he'll have to put in writing what business they're in. You know, everyone knows what business they're in. It's a well-known business. The bank people know. Once it's in writing, that's it. They're out. And you know, we could say, well, you know, why will they just be out? FinCEN has said, you know, has given guidance. They're not, you know, they just have to report it. But they have to, their risk departments make the decisions. And so a large number of hoops, yeah, he's had to go through to maintain a banking relationship. And so it's not a 0 or 1. You get to keep your bank account or not, and it's very, very expensive.
Our reality in Washington is just the opposite. Like, we don't have a single vendor that we pay by cash, not a single vendor we even pay by check. Every single one of our growers, our processors, we pay via ACH, and we refuse to do business with anybody that doesn't, and it hasn't been a problem. Just, I think Washington is probably a little bit more advanced than the rest of the country. And we had a couple of credit unions that were really early to learn the business and jump in. And we're very lucky for that.
And one of those credit unions has a section of its website devoted to a related topic, business lending. And of course, it's small businesses. That's what credit unions would do. So an argument that's been advanced, in fact, is a subject of a whole report, or a big part of it, is that banks won't support small businesses without protections, additional protections put in place for them, and so SAFE won't work. That argument, of course, avoids the whole security, safety aspect of the SAFE Act. But looking just at that, there are banks doing loans to small can businesses now. There are not nearly enough of them, and the pool of money available for that adds up much more slowly. This was subject of a webinar in the Vicente Cedarberg series, actually. The pool of money available to that grows more slowly because it's small banks who will lend to small businesses. And the small businesses face all the same risk assessments that any other type of small business would. They have less cash flow. They'll tend to have, the people will have shorter track records of successfully running businesses. They have deeper pockets. It's more risky to lend to a small business, maybe even more so in the marijuana industry, but similarly. And so the terms they get on their loans are worse. But there's small business lending happening now. When this becomes legalized, at least according to some interpretations of the SAFE Acts, and the risk goes down, it just seems likely that more banks would be willing, even if they're not, and that the pool would grow. Terms may or may not get better if there's a larger pool. I don't think SAFE will be the end of the end of all the financial industry challenges by any means. And I think that's a mistake that some of our friends have made in how they've argued for it.
Most of the businesses are unbankable anyway. Even if they're completely legal, it's pretty hard for any small business to get a bank loan without a personal guarantee and collateral. And that's not going to change with cannabis any more than it would a nail salon or a restaurant.
If I could, one more, that takes care, that's banks, but then we get to the police. The state of Washington reported a total of 5,802 robberies in 2021. Law enforcement's clearance rate was a pitiful 26.2%. Let's go back. In 2012, the state of Washington's NIBRS reports 3,849 robberies in the state. Again, a pitiful 31.38% that were cleared. That's officially cleared. That doesn't mean people were found guilty. That just means that they found someone to pin the blame on. So the question is, why do you think that passing the SAFE Act to allow banks to do business with weed shops would cut down on robberies?
If you look through my report, I have whole discussion sections on this. I see and I didn't invent these concepts. I think they're concepts people that can naturally come to. People who steal for a living or would consider doing so for all or part of the living, they make choices based on their incentives and their risk tolerance. And this in turn these incentives in turn exist in the context of the total situation at the time. And so as cash prevalence in society has contracted over recent decades, robbers have become more focused on the remaining sources of both of cash and the valuable merchandise. Okay, so one, and this is a criminological finding, research, and it makes sense. So if it's the case that robbers are focused on a smaller number of sources, this implies that the sources they're no longer focused on are experiencing either fewer robberies or not experiencing robberies now. Just algebraically, that would have to be the case. I mean, in cannabis stores, in the conceptual framework that I think makes sense, there are three types of robberies that account for the great majority of the robberies. And these are robberies targeting the back of the store to get cash from the safe. These include robberies limited to the front of the store, in which people target only the cash register. And it includes robberies at the front of the store, in which the robbers target both the cash register and product, usually through the smash and grab. In my framework considers robberies that only target product in the front, or that target product at all, alone or in combination with cash in the back, to be exceptions. Because based on the data we're seeing, which admittedly could be subject to biasing factors in reporting, those are exceptions. So look at these one by one. If electronic transactions are fully actualized and most people are paying by credit card, and cash reduces either to nothing or to a normal level, which safe might not do, step towards getting there, we hope. Probably wouldn't quite do yet, but if that happens, then there's no reason to go to the back of the store to get cash from the safe if there's not cash there. And even with some cash volume at a more normal level, at a more normal situation, cash isn't going to get kept in the store. So you want to cash in the safe. So those robberies, hard to see why they would continue. Second category, cash register only. If there isn't a lot of cash being used, there won't be a lot in the cash register. Hard to see certainly how the robberies for that purpose would continue at the same level, if at all. Third category, people at the front of the store, stealing both cash and product. This is harder to make an educated guess about because the incentives that the robbers have, it's less clear, and they probably vary from person to person or group to group. So if you're robbing the front of a store and you're really interested in cash, but you also take product, you're taking product because you're already there for the cash, you may as well take the product. If, however, your principal interest in the product is the product, Neill thinks that's less common, but at least for robbery. But if your only interest is your primary interest is the product, but you also took the cash, then you targeted the register because you're there, and you may as well get that too. If, however, the incentive needed for you to do this robbery involved the value of both the cash and the product, then you won't have the same value. And so there might not be enough incentive for you to do the robbery at all. But for this whole category, it is harder to guess. I would say still an educated guess, but a less certain one is that we should see that type of robbery at least decrease substantially, if not go away, because of a few things we see or know. One is that almost all the burglaries are of product. And so that option exists, which is less risky to do a burglary than to do a robbery in a number of ways. Second is there are very few product-only robberies that we found, just one during the time period of the surge, 2%. A bit higher, 10% for the whole 5-6 years that are there, but still the infrequent exception. And so things really seem to be tilted towards doing using burglary for product thefts and robbery for cash thefts. You really have to do that by robbery, or or which might include product. Again, uncertainty, but that's how it looks to me. Now, caveat, that analysis is based on the existing set of incentives. If we take cash out of the equation, then that's a change to the societal situation and the prevalence of cash. It's a reduction in the amount of cash. And so people who are dependent on stealing for a living, their incentives are going to be based on that new situation, which has less cash. Maybe the incentive to steal product from cannabis stores will increase in that situation because of that change, or because of the total continued progression in society that we probably can anticipate in reduced cash prevalence. And if some of the people who are stealing for a living, robbery is what they do rather than burglary, or if improved security measures to stop burglaries make that harder, then maybe there'll be more of an incentive to do armed robberies for just product. But that's speculation. But it's part of how I think we need to think about things and feel less certain. But there are lots of big picture reasons for to expect that reducing or eliminating the cash will reduce robberies. And honestly, in criminology, that's a conventional wisdom. And in the literature I found on cannabis stores and crime, and they're not focused on crimes directed at cannabis stores, unlike my study, but the authors tend to bring up cash as a criminogenic factor, and none of them say that it isn't. So to me, intellectually, that means the starting point would be that cash probably is a big factor, and I think the numbers I found really point to cash as the principal driver of armed robberies, at least in the current situation. In parts of the country, like the West Coast, Portland, of course, you would know much more about Portland than I would, Doug, but in parts of the countries where we are seeing these robberies.
Can I offer a real world example? I'm a car wash guy too. I have a car wash next to my pot shop in the Central District. During COVID, when everything was closing down, and for years, people were trying to rob us 2-3 times a month, break into the equipment to get the cash, because we're a cash business. During COVID, we stopped taking cash completely and 100% credit card, not a single attempt break-in. I mean, without cash, pot's not worth that much. You have to physically carry a lot of pot to have any value. Cash is it. And safe is the first step towards credit cards.
So that was a car wash?
Yeah.
An example, in the report, after the executive summary begins with 3 examples during the Washington surge of the pattern of robbers forcing employees to the back of the store and then assaulting them if they can't open the safe, or in one case was only able to in one case that was what happened. In another case, there were 2 safes. The employee could only open one, and in the other, the robber just didn't believe that there wasn't more, and that was a pawn shop. So it's another of one of the remaining examples of a type of robbery, of a type of business that has the double draw and of valuable merchandise and cash. I included that among the examples for two reasons. One was that one of the robbers, he said, he didn't believe that there wasn't more. He pistol whipped the employee who had just gotten him cash and jewelry and said, "I know you have more." The other reason was he was part of, that was the pair that robbed the store where Jordan Brown worked and killed Jordan Brown. So these patterns stretch across more than one type of business, but they have some lessons to teach for what's going on in cannabis businesses.
Thanks.
Right, thanks for joining us, Doug. Thanks for joining us, Ian, and Pearl and Sam for sticking around for the rest of this discussion. Anyone else want to say anything, or shall I close out the meeting? Okay, well, have a good day, everybody, and a good weekend.